We'll make a start. I know people obviously join throughout, but I'm also conscious that the slides will get shared afterwards as well. So if you're not able to do the entire presentation or miss the start, obviously you can follow up with the video and the slides as well. So I'm Peter King. I'm a senior land consultant at TerraQuest and the Planning Portal. And welcome to this waterfront webinar. The focus being, and it's obviously quite a hot topic, on land ownership and new grid connections. And we're sort of going to run through that process. If I share my screen, hopefully technology doesn't fail me. Brilliant. Hopefully everyone can see that. Obviously, any issues, just drop a message in the chat. Also, before I start as well, you'll notice in the Zoom there's a Q&A function. And I get caught out with this as well, that during a webinar, I'll think of a question, I'll be like, I'll raise to the end, get to the end, I've completely forgotten it. So by all means, put any questions you've got in the Q&A section. My colleague, Faye, who will sort of join in at the end, she'll pull those together and ask any questions. We'll allow time at the end to go through those. Worst case, if we don't get to your question, happy to sort of answer it afterwards as well. So, as I've mentioned, I'm from TerraQuest. So we are the founders in land referencing, and that's built from 50 plus years of experience across multiple sectors. That's across utilities, energy, regeneration, transport, TCPA, NSIP route. It's a variety of experience. And also through that experience and our collaboration or our ownership of the planning portal for England and Wales, which is the home of planning applications and building control. We have access to a lot to the planning data, which gives us good insights in terms of housing developments based on sort of how the planning applications are sort of stacking up, biodiversity net gain, but also uptake in solar panels, heat pumps. There's a large source of data that we sort of put out there in terms of the thought leadership piece. I'll pass on now to my colleague to Timothy, who's joined.
Morning, everyone. So Peter and I work together on a number of different projects, and so he's asked me to join and help with this. So I'm Timothy Burr. I'm a technical director with Assystem. Assystem are predominantly a nuclear consultancy, but with nuclear, you have an awful lot of infrastructure that goes with it. So you may have heard of us previously as Schofield Lothian, but now under the Assystem brand, we do an awful lot of work in this area. So we're working across a number of different areas. If you could ping to the next slide, please, Peter. So we work in predominantly the low carbon sector. So this is right within our kind of sweet spot of where we work. And as you'll see as the presentation goes on, some of the work that Peter does ties really closely into some of the reports that we can produce. And so as we go through, we'll hopefully kind of join and talk about some of these things together. As with all of these kind of projects, they're no two projects are the same. So the examples we're likely to talk about today may be completely different to the area of work that you're delivering or experiences that you've had so far. But the beauty of having TerraQuest and Assystem, and we've got a couple of other companies that come and help us, because we've got such a wide breadth of experience around different projects, we bring that kind of learning from other industries into delivering the best kind of level of service to each individual client. So, Peter, I'll hand back to you for your next slide.
Great, thank you. So I think a good starting point is setting the scene, and there's been obviously a lot of change going forward in terms of government policy. I've seen sort of press articles, also webinars. I know there was a Grid Connection waterfront session a couple of weeks back as well, with some very interesting talks covering this topic. So looking at the big picture, the focus being that, the driving focus is the sort of net zero push, particularly what the government's pushing in terms of 2030 and what they're trying to put in place to help expedite some of those processes. So there's obviously the NESO connection reforms that I know are ongoing at the moment, and I'm sure several of you on the call are probably going through that sort of that stage 2 or gate 2 evidence window, which I think closes at the end of the month, in terms of trying to get prove your readiness and how it aligns with strategic goals. Obviously quite a busy focus on that. There's been recent publications on the solar roadmap, to focus on how you accelerate solar, not just on a utility large scale, but also home developments. There's also the recent 10-year infrastructure strategy, which covers a wide variety of sectors, and that's very key when we're talking about sort of grid connections and developments. Is you're not just focusing on the generation asset, you're focusing on the demands, what's driving that need, what's driving that demand across the board, and also the infrastructure reforms that are going across as well to try and improve the process, help sort of the timescale pressures as well, and what can be put in place to give certainty in terms of, as a large grid pipeline or generation pipeline, how do we make sure that we can sort of achieve that process. So touching on the 10-year strategy, which I think was quite key to include, and there's a good infographic at the start of that report that just sort of picks up some of the sort of key high-level projects that are planned across the regions. And the reason why this is very particularly important, it doesn't go into a large amount of detail in terms of renewable or energy generation. It's all about demand that's planned in as well. So it shows that wider investment piece across sectors. Examples being the 1.5 million housing target over this sort of government, and where that's sort of going to be spread across each region. I know local authorities looking at local plans, sort of how they fit that in. There's the transport side, there's East West Rail, there's the transport for city region allocations, there's obviously HS2, which is an ongoing beast in itself. There's flood defence projects, there's also supporting new infrastructure, new schools, new hospitals to meet that housing and population growth. And the reason why it's key to all of these is all these projects will have a demand on energy generation, and they will draw on that generation. And what they need for that is that, you know, the clear and secure connections across the board, making sure that you've got the transmission lines going across the regions, you've got the localized connections, you've got the substations that have the capacity, have the ability to sort of look ahead as well. I know a lot of the DNOs are reviewing that and making sure they could forward think and look across that. But it just shows the amount of work that's involved, and that's particularly key with the land piece as well, in terms of land is being taken up for these developments, but land is also required to sort of put these assets in place, the actual generation site, the substation, the overhead lines, the connections. There's quite a lot sort of planned in that as well. The 10-year strategy does clearly pick up, and I've taken a quote from the first couple of pages about the sort of the need for that increased transmission and capacity to sort of support the speeding up of those sort of processes to help the economy to get those bits in place. Energy is a key aspect of that. So it shows all the drivers that are pushing it along. Also from the sort of Clean Power 2030 report, and this was I took it from the slide, a useful slide from the Waterfront session a few weeks back. Looking at the sort of the current installed capacity across the various generation assets, and then the sort of the scenarios of where we need to get to. Particularly important is DESNZ's capacity range. You can see the gap that's in there between if you look at wind or solar, obviously that's not covering. There's a large amount of capacity that's already in process, it's maybe being built, or it's going through the sort of final stages of getting consents and getting that all in place. It shows there is quite a big gap, and there's a lot that needs to be built within that. And a key part of that generation is making sure that the connections, the assets that are going to carry that electricity or that gas pipeline, etc., or hydrogen pipeline, they need to be in place to match that development. And you'll see that with various projects currently being developed that I'll touch on the next slide. So the need for reinforcement. So another sort of image from that Beyond 20 report, focusing on high level a map of the infrastructure to sort of be delivered beyond 2030. And there's a number of those projects that are currently going through the DCO regime. You'll take National Grid's Great Grid Upgrade, for example. You've got Scottish Power's development strategy. You've got SSEN, Large Capital Framework. There's a lot planned in there, and you can clearly see the sort of the in-scope wind farms, for example. You've got the sort of planned substations that are in place. It doesn't touch on solar, but what this image shows quite rightly is the dispersed nature of, you go from previous generation picture of very localized sites that you get generation from, where now it's quite widespread, and it's making sure you've got that ability to sort of transfer across the UK the generation, the flexibility of generations down in one region, it can sort of bring it across, but making sure there is that local support. And if you compare it to the 10-year strategy where you've got such a wide coverage, it's clear that with the new infrastructure, it also needs that wide coverage across the board to sort of meet that demand. One article I saw last week, the week before, that was a very prudent point that links back to a lot of these. Was I think there was a scheme in I think it was Northampton Waterside project, where I know they've got their consent planning permission in place, but it's been delayed because of the capacity issues, the fact that they're not going to be able to actually draw on the grid because there's just not enough capacity in that region. And that's a particularly recent article. That's obviously quite key to all of this as well. With all these developments in place, one of those considerations is going to be that capacity, which clearly this project's not quite worked and caused a delay, and you can't have that across the board as well. So quite a useful keynote from that. So touching on some of the complexities that I think we see across the board, and I don't think this is going to be new to anybody, but it's quite useful to sort of touch on, and we'll sort of mention as we go throughout the slides. The timescales is one element that has been mentioned quite a lot across the board, in terms of how you achieve those targets, those pressures of the dates and what needs to be in place to get the grid upgraded, renewables plugged in to meet that. I guess the government policy, the housing requirements, but also global pressures in place as well. So it's how we make sure, how the government are trying to, I guess, reduce the timescales, but there's only so far you can take it as well. You don't want to rush processes. We saw the land and consent side as well. It needs time to get the process right, and we'll touch on that in a bit later on about why it's always good to engage early to try and alleviate some of those timescale concerns and pressures. Availability of data. So I mentioned land registry data, but I guess across the board really is there's data's there and it's great, it's available. I guess there can always be too much data, but with any elements of data, there's going to be that notification or that acceptance. It's not a live. Some of the data is not a live cut. Land registry, for example, has a large amount of backlog. I know I live on a new build estate, and I think it took 2.5 years to get my title through. So it shows how long it can take for some of these processes, particularly if you're putting a change through. So it's always good to make clear that land registry is a good starting point, and the data sets are always a good starting point, but you've got to supplement that. You've got to ask the questions. You've got to go out and actually delve a bit more into that detail to find the threats. Firstly, make sure that the information on the register is correct and current, but what interests are in there that aren't going to be on the register, and there's going to be a large amount of interest that you've got to record across the board. Particularly important if you're looking at quite a large grid corridor that some of these schemes are going to naturally have. There's going to be a lot of data you need to pull through, and it's key to get the right people doing that. As part of being the planning portal as well, we're conscious and aware of the planning backlogs and delays, or planning bottlenecks and delays across the board. That's obviously the under-resourced local authorities in terms of being able to get those validations through. I know the government are trying to put new planning officers in place. That's probably drop in the ocean as a starting point, but there is that gap. But also there's been a recent Lord Banner review in the NSIP process, the challenges that can cause legal delays. But that review already identified the fact that NSIP processes can take time to go through the system, even without legal delays. So it's clear that those bottlenecks and delays, as a developer in particular, you've got to plan for a process, but are you going to plan what is suggested of how long the consent takes, or are you going to plan that fat on top on you? I guess worst case scenario, there is going to be delays, and how do you sort of factor that in across the board? I know there's also proposed change under the Planning and Infrastructure Bill around consultation. So trying to, I think they refer to flashing a year off delivery timescales, which obviously proofs in the pudding. It's going to be assessed and reviewed, but key concern of mine and the key thing to track is that it might remove some consultation elements. I know around category 3 parties, for example, but parties still need to be consulted, parties still need to be taken along with the journey as well. So it is removing some aspects of that, but the party community aspect is always very key, critical to that process. Linking to that, the public and community perception. So there's been reference to project fatigue. So obviously in some areas like Lincolnshire, the numbers of projects across the board, there is obviously also a good case in terms of you've got individual projects and the community engagement that's taking place, the positive feedback that's coming in. But I refer to, I think it was Second Newgate did a report, I think it was last year, about NSIP community sentiment. And there was a good infographic that referred to acceptability of projects that would typically drop if their awareness of the number of projects in an area increased. So it showed that one project in the area, they're going to be consoled, there's the acceptance, but there's that fatigue potentially of several projects, maybe getting similar letters or similar consultations. So that's going to naturally happen with a lot of developments going across the board. It's not just fatigue on the generational cable side across the board. So community engagement is very critical to that. And then legal and statutory complexity. We all know this in terms of the process. And I think it's making sure that, we always suggest getting, the right legal advice early doors is very critical to sort of, alongside the sort of land consents process that's being built up. What is the suggestion about with the consent strategy? What are the risks? What are the right processes to go down? That's always critical to include. That's sort of like a high overview of the complexity that we're all probably seeing across the board. So the role of land ownership and grid infrastructure planning. So some of the sort of key bits that I've noted from past experience of where it's quite critical. So if any of the grid connection scenario with sort of you're looking at site selection routing, you're not going to have from day one the ideal route in mind. You're going to look at various options that you need to appraise and understand. That land ownership piece is quite crucial to understand, okay, where is the, looking at a transmission line or let's say a new substation or a generation site, where is there going to be availability in land? Where is there going to be a willingness to sell and to grant rights? So that is going to be, the assessment of, is any of the land registered? If a land is registered, who owns it? Is it something that we can help with that early engagement piece as well? So the sort of land assessment from a site selection routing process is very critical, just to find actually the right avenues, but also what are the risks in that as well, in terms of potential sort of payback into parties that might maybe not be willing to sell or grant rights across the board. The cost impact. So the way I always refer to it is some of the consultants you'll get on board early days to do this. The cost of that service is minuscule in comparison to the eventual cost potentially of a risk of delay based on wrong party being included or not being consulted properly. So there is that cost impact of any service that gets undertaken. And I think that early identification of a landowner, an assessment of their willingness to engage, could potentially save you cost and time in terms of the consenting process later on if you can get an agreement in place. But also if you've got to go down, let's say, PCPA or NSIP process, try and avoid those risks of delays or challenges across the examination. I know a number of solar projects are going through with their relevant reps, etc., during the examination process. I've mentioned that the sort of timescales. Timescales obviously depends on the consenting route that's in place, but also local authorities' availability, their sort of capacity, and even the parliamentary inspectorate's capacity as well to sort of assess that. So early identification is quite key, understanding what's the best route and how much time you're giving as well. So it's always good to engage the sort of lands team early, to get that feedback, to get those thoughts, but also to make sure that within the programme, the land aspects, time is allowed. You're not squashing too much to try and rush through the process, because that is quite a key part of that element. Stakeholder engagement, community and landowner buying is very crucial. Early engagement is proven to reduce the opposition across the board, and it's finding the right strategies to sort of have that engagement. Alongside that as well, even once the asset is built, you're going to be a neighbour. It's all about maintaining relationships at the starting point and ensuring that going on, you're a good neighbour across the board as well. And that is from the lands team building that relationship early doors, but also maintaining across the board. If you need to sort of adapt or change what you've agreed with the landowner or have access at certain unique times, that relationship's going to be quite crucial. And we can't forget landowner knowledge. So as a land referencer, we're going to go through and have an activity of how we pull the data and diligent inquiry to make sure we've got that correct. But the knowledge of a landowner, they're going to know so much in terms of that area, particularly farmers who have farmed that land for quite some time. There's been multiple occasions where on registered land we can't find any information, and this farmer will refer back to a conversation had in the pub, and that will just stem across to help identify a lot of that information as well. So landowner knowledge is very crucial, and it's very important not just to be, you've got unregistered land, let's just put notice on site from day one. Engaging with that, showing that you're interested in their opinion, because they've got so much information they could provide as well. That is very crucial for the process that we're undertaking.
So I think if Peter, I'll just jump in on that slide. So again, really not trying to teach people to suck eggs, but from my experience, this early stage of engagement around these big projects is absolutely crucial. So the experience we've got at STEM is that we've got teams embedded on most of the major projects, and the ones that we're finding that have been most successful, the ones where that relationship is built early doors and is continued wherever possible throughout the delivery phases right into completion and kind of and leaving site altogether, because those conversations that are started, as Peter just said, right at the early stages when the first land referencer goes out onto a project, and actually sometimes they're the first interactions that a landowner will have knowing that there's something likely to happen, they can be really stressful. So if you farmed an area of land all your life and all of a sudden someone comes along and says, right, we want to put a cable route through here, we want to put a set of pylons through, that starts a process for those people that they didn't ask to happen. And so it's our responsibility to make sure that we make that process as smooth for them as possible as it is for our clients. And that kind of stakeholder engagement at an early stage, I can't stress enough that will actually de-risk your projects no end towards the back end of the project when you're trying to get the crane in to lift the towers in, and the farmer and the farmer's happy for you to go in and bring things in a certain route is one of those things that is really difficult to quantify. And so when you're trying to explain to a client or a contracting team that actually there is a problem, if you've got those relationships, those can also be unlocked at early stages. And a lot of times I'm seeing projects nowadays where the contractors are coming on board and they're saying, right, okay, where's the book of reference? Let's go and start looking and talking to these people. You kind of miss the boat at that point, because you need that handover, or you need those relationships to have been built, and that dialogue to have been taking place.
No, absolutely, and I think with any project as well that you're looking at, the consultant team as a developer, if you look at the developer side, as a consultant team, you're building it's that one team approach of you're going on site to speak to a landowner and you're representing a developer. It's all about having that right foot forward as well. So we always encourage at the start of any project, effectively like a communications or a com strategy of what's the right way to address that. And a good project, as we've seen, is proven when you've got a collective consultant team that can be quite vast, depending on the type of project, that works as one, that is engaging as one, that is also learning as one. And I think as a landowner, there might be an element where they're going to be speaking to quite a few different types of people, land referencers, people doing the surveys, ecologists. There's going to be quite a big variety. So it's making sure that they've got a single source of contact if they've got concerns, but also we share information about, are there vulnerable individuals on site? Is there a risk that we need to be aware of? That's proven well. You don't want that negative feedback of, I've told the same thing to 5 different people. That's where some of that fatigue comes in, some of that stress that people don't rightly want. And I think it's always that way to look at it, to say, what if it was in your community, your area? How would you feel about that as well? And I think, as a lot of people on this call know the process, know the right way of going about it, it's hard to have that appreciation. And that's why I think the landowner knowledge piece of going to consultation events, speaking to landowners, the farmers, the tenants, the community, gives you a really good understanding of that as well, and how they're feeling, and you gain that from doing as well.
The other bit I'd add is the consent granting bodies I think the consent granting bodies are often seen as the blockers in some of these projects, and they have a job to do just the same as everyone else. And if you include them and you bring them on board and you have that dialogue with them and you build that relationship, that pays dividends. So I'm currently working on Thames Tideway and we're closing that project out. We've been working on it for 11 years. And so some of these relationships you build 15 years ago are still just as vital now as they were at the beginning, if not more so, when you're trying to close out a project and you're talking about consents that are kind of historic, that most people have left the business, if I'm honest, when you're trying to close them out. That relationship piece of having a real productive dialogue is really key, because you might need that relationship to finish the project. You might also need that relationship to move on to your next project. And those are bits where I think sometimes you see a deadline and you're trying to work to it, taking a step back and looking and going, actually, do you know what? I can understand why there is a challenge there. What information extra would be helpful to deliver? Unless you've got that relationship, you can't have those very kind of in-depth conversations.
Absolutely. So, why it's so important, I'll touch on this briefly because I think we've covered a lot of the things already in terms of, I guess, no project without the legal right to use the land or acquire the land, and the land aspect is very critical to that as well. So, I think the way to look at it is if you're an engineer or a designer and you're making a tweak to a route, which might only seem like a very minor tweak on a plan, that has obviously bigger ramifications in terms of the land aspect that's in there as well. So we always sort of say, you know, focus on the land aspect and what that impact's going to have in terms of the conversations as well. So we've mentioned about the sort of helping sort of identify risks and help mitigate that, and a referencing team that's going to go on site. They're going to identify a lot of the information across the board, that wider piece. And it is very much it's never a team will they sit on it for 6 months to do the work. Here's a deliverable done. It is an ongoing process from your sort of early inception all the way through to contractor being on site. It is a full process that you're gonna be on it for like Thames Tideway, like a lot of consultants that are on HS2. You could be on it for 10 plus years to make sure it's seen all the way through. And I think it's quite critical to sort of have that appreciation that it is an ongoing element. It's an ongoing bit you're going to build across the board. And an example being that, if let's say you're doing a DCO and you submit your documents to the DCO, the day after the book reference could be out of date. It's the typical nature of how the land bit changes, but it's making sure you've got process to pick up those changes through those relationships you've already built. And I think as a reference to, let's say, working on HS2, the relationships you have with all the land agents across the route is so valuable. They have so much knowledge and they can help landowners, particularly in terms of responding to forms, notices, questionnaires, but also informing a change that can sort of be passed through. And that relationship that's been built 5-10 years ago still proving quite critical today. And it only happens from doing that at the start. It's always key. I mentioned about the recording data across the board. So a very bright and white infographic. So apologies for that. But what you'll have, and this is, I guess, not just references, but any consultant that's going about doing the process properly, is they're going to have a source. They're going to have a database, and I'm not talking an Excel spreadsheet. It's a database of what are you building over the several years? What is that data that's being brought in? Making sure, obviously, it's GDPR compliant, so it's all recorded. People have unique IDs, unique reference numbers to ensure that any of the outputs are going out. So a letter that's going to a party or they're being referred to in a document is relevant to that party. You're only sharing information that is relevant to that party, and you're only storing information as you've said in your privacy policy and as you've set out. So it's a very crucial aspect, and that system becomes a collaborative tool. So you'll see a lot of consultants having portals, having access to that data, and it's not live data. It's data that's quality assured and released at certain points. It's seeing that sort of data, and it's very important during consultations, during examinations. If you've got a party that asks you a question or voices concerns, having that single source of truth where you can record, okay, I can see you've had 2 letters from this party. I can see that they tried to call you on that date. That's very useful, instead of sort of people saying they're having the same conversation again and again with people. that single database is very critical to that process. So high level on sort of options to proceed, and I'm not going to go into that much detail about sort of consents, but there's various aspects you're going to take depending on what route you're assessing. So there's the natural sort of CPO of land that you're going to see for some of the sort of larger scale utility projects in terms of obviously the recent changes about the threshold of what is considered an NSIP, and will go down the Planning Act route, or what will go down the TCPA route based on that threshold. Onshore wind being brought into that process as well. So we're seeing a lot of that, and I think the sort of at least the NSIP list, the majority of that is sort of the renewable projects. You've also got the sort of the way leave process as well. So you're going to go in and get potentially a voluntary way leave agreement to sort of have access to that land, agreement with the landowner to sort of go across and to undertake certain maintenance across the year. There's obviously the statutory necessary need if you can't get that voluntary agreement, which is, I guess, scenario you want to avoid, but there are those elements in place. You can use a lot of sort of utility companies will use the New Roads and Street Act to put assets under the highway. So you might assess as part of your options, can we put any of these assets under the highway if there's capacity and there's room? That route could be an option for certain developers if they've got the right and the powers to, depends on the local authority. In most cases, you've got to sort of look for a way leave agreement or an easement, or potentially use the beauty of the sort of DCO process. You've got the CPO powers, but also the I guess the additional sort of consent and rights element with that as well, that people can use if you're of a certain threshold. But I know there's been conversations about an opt-in, opt-out process that might be sort of attractive to certain individuals. So I guess focusing on a route optioneering process. So that sort of bit we're focusing on at the moment is that you've got your let's say your generating site. You've got to get from A to B. You've got to get to your point of connection. What's the process you need to undertake with that? So looking at the route optioneering process, which is effectively quite a key aspect you're going to do early doors. You're going to go through and define that, I guess what's our aim? What do we want to get out of this? What are we focusing on? I know a good example being, because we do a lot of work with National Grid. I think they make reference to a swathe. So you're going to put in a wide corridor to maybe have a good flexibility. You're going to, as you progress, I guess, narrow down that swathe to a more defined area, but you might still have optionality within that. And that allows you to undertake, the constraints mapping, pulling out what constraints are in there, land planning, environmental, pulling out those options from that as well. So how many options are you pulling through? Are you assessing a highway option, a private land option? And I think that's critical later down the line. So you can tell the story of, yes, I'm speaking to you because we want an easement over your land, but we have considered all these other options, and this is why we're going down this route. And I think with that appraisal aspect, you're getting the output of, I guess, that story piece that's going to be very crucial to maybe a consultation strategy or documentation later on of what you've done throughout that process. So this sort of roadmap, it makes it seem like it's a very quick activity. You've got to allow time for that process, and we'll go into a bit more detail about that process through the next couple of slides. Brilliant. So early doors, it's a very high level mock-up. I guess quite a not too bad grid corridor. Obviously, you might get a big variety of corridors across that you'll need to look at. So as I say, you've got your generation site, you've got your connection point, you've got an idea of your connection point. So at that early phase, you're going to define, what do we want to get out of this? What is our expected outcomes across the board? You're going to find timescales within that. So if you're bringing in appointed technical consultants, you've got to. It's always encouraged to get their thoughts of what they recommend in terms of timescales to undertake an activity. And I think once you've done it a couple of times, you'll get an understanding of the right fit for a lot of this. And as you start looking at this, you might have a landowner that's probably under option or in a good position, because otherwise you wouldn't be looking at the site, and you would have had early sort of engagement of a grid connection point across the board. You've got to start mapping the constraints from that as well. So it's typically a desktop study. What can you pull out from that? So you'll look at the land picture to see what land registry is telling you, and that's there's a lot more data to sort of have that as an easy, intuitive tool. You've got to avoid, obviously, the built-up areas where possible. So that's sort of like grey, black hatching. You've got to avoid maybe minimise areas that are sensitive. You also got to review any sort of local planning policy. I think very key to be aware of. It's going to help your conversations with local authorities at a later point. But also, I think very crucial now is to review other proposed applications within the area. So, looking at the transmission entry capacity, what else is planning to be put into that connection point you're going for? What else is in that area as well? Just to have appreciation of, as I mentioned before, the community aspect of what else are they seeing in the area, but also the story of you've seen applications over the past few years. What challenges have they come across? What have they seen that you could apply to your project as well? And I've mentioned sort of the desktop land study that gives you a good high level viewpoint to build on from there. You'll define various options, and with those options, you want to make sure you allow variety. So I mentioned highway land and third party land. You'll carry out an appraisal. So I've seen clients do quite well. The sort of brag status of you'll have certain categories: land, environmental, etc. You'll define a scoring against that will go to an element. And I think with that, you'll define what are the risks, but what are the opportunities in that element as well. So you might have a favourable landowner, but there might be challenges in terms of unregistered land across the route. So you can map all that out. It's critical with that you use the same process. So it's a fair process across the board. So they're very comparable when you look at the output. Tim, over to you.
So I thought we'd just run through very quickly, because Peter's run through a lot of the land side of things, and this is where Assystem and Turquoise work quite closely together. These are the kind of reports that we pull together for clients doing grid connections or solar farms or any kind of linear scheme, really, where we try and pull all that information together. Because as Peter was saying, trying to choose that correct route is really important. You're pulling all that information together, and time is money at the early stages, and so making sure that you have the best possible route and you know what your challenges are as early as possible means that you can dedicate that time, as I was talking about earlier on, to getting to know the people that we're going to be affecting, to understand what the challenges are, and to understand what any mitigation is required. And if design change is going to be needed early doors, the earlier you can tackle them, the more confident you are going to be around that cost element, which, let's be honest, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do here is provide a kind of a connection or a scheme at the most cost-effective way of delivering it. And so this kind of report may be something that many of you have seen before. And so I haven't planned to go into huge amounts of detail, but as Peter was saying, we try and rag these for a client. So if you've not got that technical information as your background, you can look at a scheme and you can look at various different routes, and you can present these at board level with a fairly a fairly good view of what the challenges are that are easy for people to understand. So these are the general kind of things that we would run through, and Peter's team feed into a lot of the background data. So going back to what Peter was saying earlier on, with TerraQuest's access to planning portal, they have that information that is actually really useful for clients to understand what other schemes are happening in the area, what other planning applications are likely to be affecting it. So if you go on to the next slide, Peter. So this is an example project that we've done for a client, and so we'll go through and we'll assess what we think is going to be a challenge and what we think is something that we need to flag and something that we couldn't overcome. And again, this scheme is actually quite, I'm not going to say easy to deliver, but it's quite straightforward. So there are no major risks. We'd be looking to understand whether there are other DCO projects in the area that are likely to have safeguarded land. So some of the projects that are going up the central belt of the country have massively been impacted by the safeguarding HS2 has put on. So anyone that's wanting to do stuff that kind of crisscrosses any of the HS2 route has had to be really careful about what routes they take and understand what the impacts of that's going to be on what may be a very small scheme for your client, but it has a big impact on other linear projects. So that's the kind of information again that we'd be pulling through and understanding, and the background that TerraQuest have give us that that wide area of knowledge that we can pull in, so we can be giving you as clients really early kind of information about what other challenges are likely to be coming across, because you'll be focusing on, right, I need to get from A to B, and sometimes we go and hold a minute, you're aware that there's a motorway coming through here, or there's something that sometimes it's the really obvious big schemes that just you haven't really paid attention to. If you want to fly on to the next slide, Peter. And again, this is where we start looking at overlaying aerial photography and the other information that we can pull in, so that it's really clear and concise and understandable how the impact of your scheme is going to interact with what's happening around it. This, again, apologies if I'm taking people to suck eggs if this is your chosen field, but being able to show people that are not usually doing this, what the impact of a scheme is on either an aerial photograph or a fly through, or another visual way of showing this information is really useful. So we have a big community engagement and stakeholder team, and actually, if you can produce something like this that shows people where their house is, where they're impacted, not only does the information we're producing now form a really useful part of an early kind of feasibility study for a client, it performs a dual task of giving that background information to anyone that does want to come along and do that stakeholder engagement, because it gives them the tools to be able to do that in one fell swoop. And then you're giving the same information at different levels to different people. You can pick and choose what information has, but you know that that single source of truth is not likely to change. So if you're telling a resident that the cable route is going to skirt around the end of the field near their house, it's not going to impact their kids' playground, you don't want that to change unexpectedly. And so having that single source and relying on really easy to understand data and visual images like this is key. If you can fly to the next slide. I'm flying through this a bit quickly because I'm conscious that we want to give you enough time to ask any questions at the end. So I'll hand back to Peter at this stage.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, no, you're right. I think onto the time. So, I mean, yeah, very, very useful in terms of identifying that piece. And I think as you get to the sort of the end part of the optioneering, you're going to pull through that land picture. So the bits in green, land that's owned. You could also pull through unregistered lands, identify sort of, is there any highways or any network rail? What's that sort of constraint across the board? And it's going to give that very good picture, especially if we're looking at several options. What are the risks in there in terms of, okay, this land has got network rail, this land overlaps with a planned development already, be it housing or another generation connection point. This has got more unregistered land, this has got Crown. There's various assessments you could undertake across the board, and it's bringing together various elements and expertise, sort of present that in the right format that can be understandable and reflected on as well. So I think a key bit to touch on. I think a very brief element after that, sort of the post feasibility stage is. So let's say you've done that assessment, you've got a way forward, you've got to progress going forward from that option selection. You're going to go a bit more in terms of a stage 2 feasibility. Sort of say I'm going to look at maybe one or two options. I'm going to go into a bit more detail of, okay, with high level we've identified risks for opportunities. What could that mean? What mitigation could be put in place from that point? And once you've got that, you've got to go out on the land and start having those early conversations, building those relationships with the landowner, the land agent, trying to understand from that, okay, our consent strategy has this plan, and it might be a DCO down the line, let's say, because of the scale, but let's try and get some negotiations already in place. Let's try and get some heads of terms signed up and agreed early days. With the community aspect, you've got the consultation, making sure you're inviting public and inviting comment. Obviously, there's a planned change for some of the consultation aspects, but very critical for the local area. With the consenting preparation, we all know that for certain, well, majority of applications, there's a lot of documents to pull together and a lot of crossover as well. So that sort of relationship building you're building with the consultant team that's been built, so that's very critical when you get to that nitty-gritty, very intensive application process. Those little minor things of making sure you're using the same templates or you're aware of where the give-gets are across certain consultants, you just avoid that. You already have that agreed and in place from the get-go. So when you get to examination and implementation after the fact, and obviously this is doesn't give you a timescale on this, but it can take quite a few years in certain projects, you've got that across the board. Even if people or teams come and go, there's record of that across the board. And then I think lastly, looking at, I guess, the element of GIS and data. Tim, if I hand back to you.
Yeah, so I've touched on this briefly in my last slide, but the everything is going digital, and the information that needs to be updated in these formats is so much easier if you use a really good GIS system. So we're working with TerraQuest on a number of projects, and the quality of that representative data is really important for a number of reasons. And again, I won't dwell on it too much, but using that single source of truth to be able to pull out fly-throughs for the residents, fly-through for the construction teams, and showing actually the works on site where some of the risks are. So I spent some time in a previous job working for a construction company, and the environment team worked for me, and actually being able to visually represent on site where the watercourses were, where there were protected species, where any of those areas you need to avoid, not only has an impact on the consultation bit and the consenting bit that we're talking about now, actually the delivery on the ground. Once you give that information over to a contractor, if you give it to them as a paper form, invariably it sits on the dashboard of a transit van in a car park, not on the site. But if you are working from a system like this from the start, and you can transfer that information to the people that are actually doing the work, because you might have built that really good relationship with the farmer at the beginning, but unless the people who are actually there delivering it on the ground after digging or laying the cables or managing the site know that those commitments are there, you can put as much time and effort into them as possible at the beginning, and everything will be lost towards the end, and you will have an absolute nightmare finishing off the scheme. So again, conscious of time, but one thing I would say is if you're delivering a project, really look at your digital footprint and see how you can really integrate from very beginning right to the very end that single source of truth, because it will absolutely pay dividends.
And then I think sort of lastly, role of technology. So single source of truth is something that I bang on about constantly. Is making sure that with the land data, you're doing various things that other people are relying on. So going out and doing surveys or even the consent build afterwards, you've got a single source of truth you're using. You're not using outdated data. Seeing various instances of that in the sort of past experience that causes risk and alarm that you just easily can avoid as well. And I think the clear audit trail is quite key for that as well. So building that story across the board. So finally, because I just want to make sure we leave time for Q&A. So starting sort of the land side early is crucial, and that's something I always mention about making sure it's in the program. Early conversation, early sort of advice is always key. We know that grid connections can't move forward without the clear land rights in place. It has to be there. Good straits have to be identified early to help avoid those delays. As Timothy says, technology is there. It's changing pace. It's changing every day. We need to utilize it, but making sure that people understand it and getting the most out of it. That we don't just want to give you a system and then like, here you go, but not tell you how you're going to benefit it based on what you need it for. So hopefully, the hope is that was useful across the board. But as I say, we'll allow some time for Q&A now, and I'll see if Faye is able to jump in now. But if you do have any questions after the fact, our email details are in there and will be shared afterwards. So we're happy to give you some time after sort of run through any queries you have. But Faye, if I pass over to you for any Q&A.
Yes, so we've had a couple of questions in the chat. So the first one is, how will the reforms to streamline the consenting process change the early stage of projects? And do you think they may lead to more holdups down the line?
No, it's a good question. I think there's obviously a large amount planned in with the consent process going forward, and I think a lot of it it's a wait and see, which is unfortunate in a way. And I know that there's been various suggestions about there's been the fast track process been put in for NSIP projects where uptake has it been that good and is it proven? It's hard to say, but I think there are encouraging signs in terms of trying to get a process through. But we're all aware in the industry that ideal scenario is that you're getting stuff by agreement, so you don't need to use compulsory consents later down the line. Not always possible, I know, but I think that early engagement is always quite key. And I think it depends. Certain areas are going to have more of an impact or more of a concern, like Lincolnshire, where there is a lot planned already. So I mean, there's hope there, but I think with a lot of things as well, it's a wait and see to see how these projects progress through. And I think we've seen a lot of solar projects go through and get acceptance, which is good. And I think there's a few that are sort of planned in, and that's why it's always for us, the PINS data is quite useful, but also as a developer as well, if you're going through and planning a project, looking at what's been before you, in terms of what's been learned, what lessons can you apply is quite crucial to that.
I think just moving away from slightly from the land side of things, the secondary consents are really going to be the bit that challenges us. And if you look at the way Transport Works Act orders differ from some of the other ways that projects are consented, a lot of the challenges are dealt with up front. And again, it comes back to the general theme of what we've been talking about, is if you can highlight issues, you know what you're going to need, and you can give people the kind of the heads up that there are things happening further down the line, and they know that that's happening, they can plan that in, then everyone has longer to manage those challenges, and you don't get so many surprises. Because let's be honest, there is a reason why things require consent. So if you're going to cut across water, you need a water course consent. There is massive public outcry at the moment at the quality of water, and so very rightly there is a regime there to manage that and make sure it's protected. And so that's not going to change. And so the way we need to manage this is manage it more effectively so that those protections are still there, but are effectively integrated into the project timelines, as opposed to finding out about them at the last minute.
Fantastic. And how early in the planning process should land rights be investigated to avoid delays?
I think we always encourage early days where possible to sort of do that identification. So identifying what's there already, but also the sort of setting out what you need to do to get in place as well. So it's not a costly activity to do early days, but there is a quite big risk if it's not done rightly. So as part of any feasibility strategy, it's been undertaken early doors. Identifying that, I guess, is going to help avoid delays, to understand what the risks are that you can take forward and tell that story across the board as well. So yeah, I think earlier the better. Even just an early conversation with a reference or a lands team to sort of get advice is always encouraged before you sort of proceed with the project.
And how do we resolve issues with unregistered land, as the land registry does not hold the information about the land?
No, it is right, depending on certain regions you're looking at. I know we're looking at Scotland, it's a slightly different set of England and Wales, but there is quite a lot of unregistered land that is getting mapped. So I think it is encouraging, firstly, the acceptance that there is a gap in data that we need to investigate, and you can only encourage landowners so far to sort of get land registered. We know typically local authorities don't have a lot of land registered in terms of highway land. So I think it is, you've got options through, if you're developing a scheme, that's obviously going to help you register land if you've got something planned. And I know that some CPO projects will use that to sort of make sure land is registered, but also sort of cleanse title. But I think it is that acceptance that land registry doesn't hold that information always, and there is consultants out there that can identify that using the knowledge. And as data gets better, there is availability in there, but it's making sure that it's not a prediction. It's got to be fact. It's got to be based on what information is out there, and it's finding the sort of right people. So I think it's always going to be an issue, which is why you need sort of the right people in there to sort of pull that data through.
And something that Peter mentioned right at the beginning, if you're going to get out on site and meet the people that are affected, they will quite often have the answers. I've been out on site and had unregistered land, and the farmer will say, "Oh yeah, my cousin owns that. Go and speak to him." And then you'll go around and sit in their kitchen. They'll pull their deeds out of their safe, and they've got the old-fashioned, massive, kind of coloured plans that just were never registered at land registry because they haven't transferred the ownership in the time that digitalization has happened, and it was a requirement to do that. So again, it's that getting out, meeting people, and talking to them, because there's that information is there. You just have to find the right person to ask quite often.
Fantastic. And just to answer the question that's just been popped in, the presentation slides are going to be made available. And Peter, are we able to send the link to the planning and development assessment report?
So I think, yeah, as Faye says, we're going to send the slides across. Then what me and Timothy will do is we'll have a look at if there's any useful data that we can provide us. Like, obviously, any reports we do provide will be redacted information, sort of text sensitive information. But any information that we do send across will Faye send across. If there is anything in there that you do look at and think, oh, I want to know a bit more, maybe see an example, by all means, just drop me and Timothy a line, and we're happy to sort of go through that with you or give you a sort of an example report to look at.
Fantastic. And I think the final question, talking about landowner engagement. So can proactive landowner engagement actually reduce costs in the long term? Or is it just shifting costs elsewhere, such as, inter-stakeholder management?
Yes, I think it can, because having that early days conversation, having that early identification piece, it is going to reduce the impact of likelihood of needing to use compulsory powers if you can get certain bits agreed. And obviously, you might, as a developer, pay above the sort of standard CPO rate to get a land in place, but it could save you time at a later point as well. So it is all case by case. But as I've mentioned before, the sort of the land strategy piece, compare the cost of that compared to a potential delay, it just doesn't weigh exactly the same. So it is always encouraged with that. And I think any assessment you're looking at as part of a feasibility report, you could obviously look at cost and time implications. What's the impact of going with option A or option B? And I think cost obviously is a crucial with that, especially with sort of costs going up in terms of sort of construction phase, and that's what you see in the news across the board. Costs are a key aspect to keep in mind as well.
Brilliant. And I believe that's all of our questions.
Great, thank you, Faye. But yes, I think we'll close there. As we've sort of said, we hope that was useful. The slides will be sent across and a bit more information about ourselves. If there is any queries that you have across the board, drop us an email. We're happy to sort of give you any sort of advice or any feedback. But we appreciate your time this morning, and thank you all for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.